Life here is a routine, a steady cadence punctuated by duty and a quiet kind of domesticity. Married to Emma, we've built a life that looks just about perfect from the outside. We met through friends and hit it off because of our shared desire for something steady, something certain. Early on, our life was like a classic military family story. Long work days for me, evenings for Emma with the kids, and weekends spent at the kids' sports games or BBQs. It's the kind of life you can get comfortable in, sometimes too comfortable. Emma's the quiet, dependable type, with this beauty that's almost understated. She's far from the kind of person to demand attention. Instead, she's the one who quietly holds everything together while the rest of us rush around. Our two kids adore her, and they should. She's devoted her life to them and to me, always making sure things run smoothly, from school pickups to making sure I come home to a hot meal after a long day. I know it's not easy for her, living with the constant uncertainty of deployments, of me being pulled away at a moment's notice, but she bears it with that kind of calm resilience. I wish I could say our relationship has only strengthened over time, but it'd be a lie. We've grown comfortable, sure, but that comfort has turned into a kind of distance. Conversations that used to be full of dreams and laughter have narrowed down to logistical exchanges. Who's picking up the kids? What bills are due? Even sitting across from her at the dinner table feels more like going through the motions than connecting. It wasn't always like this, and sometimes I catch myself thinking about how it used to be, wondering how we drifted into this routine that feels almost suffocating. With the kids around, we keep things light, never wanting them to sense the quiet tension that's grown between us. I love them fiercely, and the time I spend with them is a grounding force in my life. But even with them, I can feel the impact of being away so much. My son's at the age where he's more interested in video games and friends than hanging out with dad, and my daughter is always on her phone, laughing at some TikTok video or gossiping with friends. I try to stay involved, but there's a distance there, too, one that's hard to bridge after so much time spent apart. Some nights, I come home, see Emma sitting in the living room, and wonder if she feels the same sense of disconnection. She's always there, yet I feel like I'm miles away from her, like we're both just waiting for the next deployment to start or end, using it as a reason for why things aren't the same. She never complains, and sometimes I wish she would. Anything to break this endless loop of silence and routine. But that's just not who she is. Life in the military gives you a sense of purpose, but it also steals something. It takes away the small moments that make up a marriage, those quiet, everyday things that let you feel close. It feels like Emma and I have been on separate paths for a long time now, both of us just coexisting, carrying on, each hoping the other will make a move to bridge the gap. Yeah, Emma's been part of this informal group with a few of the other military wives around here. They call it something like the waiting club, kind of ironic but fitting, I guess. It's mostly wives who know the drill, deployments, stretches of solo parenting, the weight of waiting. They get together a couple of times a month, sharing a bottle of wine and trading stories that probably sound too strange or intense to anyone outside the military world. There's something comforting about it for them, I think. They'll laugh, cry, vent, all the things they can't always do when they're alone. They all get what it's like to go weeks or months without so much as a text, to feel like you're running the house solo. Some of the husbands show up from time to time, joining in on poker nights or BBQs, but mostly, it's the wives leaning on each other. I went once. Emma convinced me it'd be good to meet the other husbands, but it felt odd, like I was intruding on their space. The guys that were a mix, some quiet and guarded, others talkative, maybe even a little too friendly after a drink or two. I could tell they'd been dragged there, too, probably as a show of support for their wives. But there was something about being in that room, listening to Emma and the others talk about the sacrifices they make, the anxiety of not knowing, that got to me. It reminded me of just how much Emma's held it all together while I'm off dealing with my own challenges. Those meetings are a lifeline for her, I think. She gets to release some of that built-up tension, swap stories, and laugh with others who really get it. And the more I see her come back from those nights a little lighter, a little more relaxed, the more I understand just how much she's been carrying on her own. It's one of the few places she can be Emma, not just the wife holding down the fort. The way those meetings work, it's not unusual for husbands to step in, especially if one of them is back while another's deployed. If a guy's around while someone else is off in the Middle East, or who knows where, he might go along with his wife just to support the group. Everyone pretty much knows each other, at least in passing. We've all crossed paths at BBQs, base events, or kid functions, so there's this kind of informal network. When you've been around long enough, it's almost like an extended family. Close, but with boundaries no one wants to admit are there. It's a bit of a balancing act, though. I mean, most of us guys don't spend too much time on the deep stuff, not the way the wives do. But we get it too. Deployments were on us all. So if one of us can make it, even if just to grill or make sure everyone has what they need, we're there. It's also about showing respect, even solidarity for each other's families, knowing someone's watching out for our own loved ones while we're gone. But it's a bit strange, too. There's always this underlying sense of, what's the word, vulnerability, I guess. The kind of unspoken acknowledgement that our lives depend on each other. Not just out there on deployment, but back home, too. I've heard stories, how someone's wife gets close to another guy, how things start to cross a line. And that's where it gets tricky. I trust Emma. And we've been solid, but the whole setup has this potential for things to get complicated, especially when you mix in the loneliness and the constant tension everyone's carrying. But when you're in it, you kind of just trust that everyone's on the same page, that no one's going to mess around or break that line of respect. You hold on to that trust like a lifeline because, honestly, it's all you've got some days. And when I get back and the guys tell me about the last few meetings I missed or joke about how they kept an eye on Emma, I just play along, assuming it's all just harmless camaraderie. It has to be. Otherwise, none of us would be able to stomach it. Serving at Fort Bragg is a world of its own. It's like a city within a city. Constant activity, noise, people always moving with purpose. There's a weight here, knowing this place has been a launch pad for some of the biggest operations in recent history. I signed up young, looking for purpose and a way out of my small town, and ended up in special operations. You can feel the history in every training field, every briefing room. It's a place that shapes you, forces you to keep pushing even when you're bone-tired and just want to quit. Deployments come fast and hard. It's not the 9-to-5 life most people live. When you're on a mission, you're gone, sometimes with barely enough time to say goodbye. Over the years, there have been so many quick, midnight goodbyes with Emma that I've lost count. She got used to it after a while, knew the routine. I'd pack, kiss her and the kids, and be out the door before dawn, headed to some base, eventually onto a plane bound for a country with a name I'd sometimes only learned hours before. There are moments I wonder if I'm doing it for the right reasons anymore, or if I'm just sticking with what I know, but that's the nature of the work. Keeping in touch with Emma while I'm gone is complicated. The phone calls are few and far between, sometimes non-existent for weeks on end. Internet spotty, so when I get a minute, I'll send her a quick message, maybe a photo if we're lucky. There are times I'll wait for hours, hoping for a signal, just to hear her voice on the other end. That moment when she picks up, even with the lag and the static, makes the whole day brighter. We'll talk about the kids, what she made for dinner, the funny thing our daughter said at school, just anything to make me feel closer to home. But, man, is it hard. Emma is a rock. She's held down the fort with the kids, handled everything solo when I'm away. I love her for that. But distance is a problem no matter how strong you are. You miss anniversaries, birthdays, those simple, lazy weekends together. Eventually, it's like you're living two separate lives, even though you're married. She'll handle a crisis at home, something with the kids, maybe a repair gone wrong, and I'll be out in the middle of nowhere, unable to do a damn thing to help. There's a guilt that comes with that, and a frustration too. You start wondering if she resents you for always being away. Hell, you start resenting yourself for it. Emma and I loved each other deeply, no question, but the distance put cracks in us. There'd be times when we'd argue over the phone, barely able to hear each other, and I'd hang up feeling worse than I did before. It wasn't her fault. She was just exhausted from doing it all on her own, and I'd feel the guilt pile up, knowing I was too far away to be the husband and father they needed. And when I'd finally get back, we'd try to find that rhythm again, try to go back to normal. But sometimes it was hard. It's like we were both so used to our separate roles. The distance had become its own thing, this barrier we couldn't always get past. I loved Emma with everything I had, but the strain of military life tested that love in ways I didn't see coming. There were times I'd come home to find her with this exhausted look, a weariness I couldn't shake off her shoulders. She'd smile. We'd try to catch up, but sometimes it felt like the real her was somewhere else, too worn down by the years of being alone. It was tough to see, tougher to know I'd been the cause. So we'd go on, patching things up one deployment at a time, always hoping that this would be the last one, and that maybe, finally, we could just be together without the distance wedged between us. Coming back from my last mission, I was ready for that feeling of relief you get when you're finally home, the sense that you can exhale, settle in, and let your guard down for the first time in months. I walked in the door, bags in hand, expecting the usual. Emma greeting me with that quiet smile of hers, maybe the kids running up to give me a hug. But this time felt off, even before I saw her. The house was quiet. The kids were out with friends, and Emma was sitting at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a coffee cup. She looked up as I walked in, but her eyes didn't light up the way they used to. She just watched me with this distant expression, like she was looking at a stranger. I set my bags down, took a step toward her, but she didn't move, didn't say anything. "Emma," I said, trying to break through that wall I could already feel between us. She finally met my eyes and, after a long pause, said, "We need to talk." I pulled out a chair across from her, sitting down slowly, bracing myself. We'd had hard conversations before, but this felt different, colder. Her gaze dropped to her hands as she took a deep breath. "I don't love you anymore," she said, the words flat, final, like she'd rehearsed them 100 times. It was like a punch to the gut, her voice so calm and detached, with no sign of the warmth I remembered. I searched her face, waiting for some kind of explanation, some crack in that cold exterior, but there was nothing. Just this emptiness in her eyes. "Emma, what are you talking about?" I managed to get out, barely able to keep my voice steady. She shrugged slightly, looking away. "I don't know. I don't feel the same way anymore. It's been coming for a while, I think. I'm sorry." But there was no apology in her voice, no sadness. Just this calm, controlled tone that made the whole thing feel surreal. "Did something happen?" I asked, desperate to make sense of it. "Did I do something wrong?" I ran through every possible mistake in my mind, every deployment, every missed anniversary, every late-night argument over the phone. I'd messed up plenty, but I thought we'd always find a way back to each other. She looked at me, and for a second, I thought I saw something flicker in her expression, some hint of the woman I loved. But it was gone just as quickly, replaced by that same distant calm. "It's not about you, Luke. It's just, I don't love you anymore. I'm tired. Tired of waiting, of hoping things would change. And they haven't. I haven't. We haven't. Emma, please, just tell me why." I begged, my voice cracking. I reached for her hand, but she pulled away, folding her arms over her chest, closing herself off even more. "I don't have a why," she said simply. "I just don't feel anything anymore. I tried everything. I told her we could work on it, see a counselor, take some time away, whatever she needed. But she just shook her head, like none of it mattered. Every word I said seemed to slide right off her, like she'd already made up her mind. It was like trying to talk to someone who wasn't there, like the woman I loved had already checked out and left me with a stranger who just happened to look like her. Finally, I sat back, defeated. "So that's it?" I asked quietly, barely able to believe it. "You're just done?" She looked at me with those cold, unfeeling eyes and nodded. "Yeah, I think I am." I don't know how long we sat there in silence, the weight of it all pressing down on me until I could barely breathe. When she got up and left the room, I just sat there, staring at the spot where she'd been, feeling like my whole world had crumbled right in front of me, and I couldn't do a damn thing to stop it. The day after Emma dropped that bombshell, I was still reeling, trying to make sense of everything. My mind was a mess, going in circles, trying to find the cracks I must have missed along the way. I'd barely slept, every quiet moment twisting the knife deeper. That's when Lieutenant Dan called me. We hadn't talked much since I'd been back, and he hadn't been on my last mission, so his voice felt like a reminder of a different world, one that seemed almost unreal now. "Hey man," Dan said, his tone quiet, like he already knew I wasn't in the best place. "Listen, I was wondering if we could meet up. Just talk." There was a pause, the kind that made it clear he had something specific on his mind. I couldn't quite place it, but the way he said it made me uneasy. I agreed, figuring maybe he'd heard something about Emma, something I was too blindsided to see myself. We met at a little diner off base, the kind of place we'd go to on slow weekends, grabbing coffee and trying to escape the routine of base life. He was already sitting in a booth when I walked in, a coffee cup in hand, staring down into it like it held some kind of answer. When I sat down, he looked up at me, and there was this hint of guilt in his eyes. "How you holding up?" he asked, clearly knowing more than I'd expected. Word traveled fast, I guess, though I hadn't told anyone yet. I shrugged, trying to keep my face neutral. "Not great, man. She just told me she doesn't love me anymore." No warning. No reason. I ran a hand through my hair, not even sure what else to say. Dan looked down, taking a long sip of his coffee, and I could tell there was something weighing on him, something he didn't want to say, but knew he had to. Look, Luke, he finally started, his voice low, careful. There's something I think you need to know. I wouldn't bring this up if I didn't think it mattered, but well, you know my situation. You know why my wife and I split. I nodded, recalling the mess he'd gone through with her. She'd been unfaithful, and when he found out, it was like his whole world shattered. They tried to patch things up, but in the end, she'd left, and Dan was left picking up the pieces. Well, when I was going to those meetings, the Waiting Wives group, with her, I started noticing things, he continued, his gaze shifting uncomfortably. Emma was there. She showed up a lot, more than you'd probably think. He paused, glancing around the diner like he was worried someone might overhear, even though it was just the two of us in that corner booth. At first, it didn't seem like a big deal. Everyone's just trying to get through the deployment, you know? Support each other. But he trailed off, struggling with whatever he was trying to tell me. I could feel my heart pounding, every second dragging out like it was pulling a weight. Just say it, Dan. I pressed, needing him to rip the Band-Aid off. He sighed, finally meeting my eyes. She and I talked sometimes after the meetings. Not a lot, but enough that I noticed there was, something different about her. The way she'd mention you, the way she'd linger after everyone else left. I didn't think much of it until after my wife and I split. Emma and I, we got close. Not in a bad way, not in the way you might think, but enough that I started seeing her as more than just someone's wife. I could feel my stomach twisting, my mind racing, but I kept listening. She was there for me after the divorce. He went on, almost painfully hesitant. We had a connection, Luke. Nothing happened between us, but there was this tension, you know? I think she was hurting too. She'd tell me things about your marriage, things I could tell were eating at her. She said she felt invisible, like you were more married to the military than to her. I didn't know what to say. I felt like the ground was slipping out from under me, like the reality I'd been clinging to was disintegrating with every word he spoke. So, what are you saying? I finally managed, my voice barely above a whisper. He shook his head. I'm saying that she was looking for something. And man, I don't know if she found it with me or someone else, but she was slipping away long before you came back. I don't want to tell you this, but I thought you deserved to know. She wasn't just waiting while you were gone. She was searching for something you weren't there to give. I sat there in stunned silence, every word hitting me like a sledgehammer. Dan had been one of the few people I trusted, and now he was telling me that my wife, the woman I thought I knew better than anyone, had been confiding in him, leaning on him in ways she hadn't with me. Did she ever? Did you too? I couldn't even finish the sentence, the thought of it too painful to voice. No, he said firmly, looking me in the eye. Nothing ever happened, not physically anyway. But emotionally, I think she was already gone, Luke. She needed something, and when you were deployed, she found it somewhere else. I am sorry. No. I could barely breathe, barely think. The pieces started to click into place. The coldness, the distance, the way she'd looked right through me when I came home. I didn't know whether to be angry, heartbroken, or just numb. When I got back home from meeting Dan, I could still feel his words weighing on me, settling in like some kind of twisted truth I couldn't shake. He tried to make it sound like it wasn't anything serious, like Emma and he had just connected on some emotional level because of their own issues. But there was this gnawing feeling in my gut, a sense that he'd held something back. Emma was in the living room when I walked in, sitting on the couch, scrolling absently through her phone. She barely looked up when I came in, and that just fueled the anger that was already building up inside me. I took a deep breath, trying to keep myself steady, but the words came out more forcefully than I intended. I know about you and Dan. Her hand froze on the phone, her eyes flicking up to meet mine. For a moment, she just stared at me, her expression a mix of shock and something else. Maybe guilt? Fear? She opened her mouth to say something, then stopped, her eyes dropping to the floor. Did you really think I wouldn't find out? I pressed, my voice shaking, the words spilling out before I could stop them. He told me everything. He told me you two got close. More than close. You had sex with him, didn't you? She looked away, her hands gripping the edge of the couch cushion tightly. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Yes, she whispered, barely audible. It happened. The room felt like it was closing in on me, the walls pressing in until I could hardly breathe. I wanted to scream, to break something, to demand why she'd done this. Instead, I just stood there, staring at her, feeling a mix of anger, betrayal, and a hollow, gnawing ache that I couldn't put into words. "How long?" I asked, the words coming out in a strangled whisper. She sighed, finally looking back up at me, her expression unreadable. It didn't happen all at once. We started talking after one of those meetings, and they escalated. I was lonely, Luke. I was angry. You were always gone, and it felt like I was living a life I hadn't signed up for. Danny was there. He listened. He understood. "So that's it?" I said, my voice louder now, filled with anger I could barely control. "I'm off risking my life, and you're here doing this?" "It's not that simple," she replied, her tone defensive, her eyes flashing with a frustration that made my blood boil. "You left me here year after year, expecting me to just wait, to put my life on hold while you went off, chasing whatever it was you needed out there. Do you know what it's like to feel invisible? To feel like your husband is more committed to his job than to you? Do you know what it's like to come home, to risk everything out there, only to find out that your wife has betrayed you?" I shot back, my voice raw. "If things were so bad, why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you say something before it got to this?" She looked down, her voice softening. "Because I was afraid. I didn't want to make things worse. And then, over time, I don't know, it just became easier to hide it, to keep going through the motions." I could feel the tears threatening to spill over, the anger and pain mixing in a way that made me feel sick. "Did you ever plan to tell me? Or were you just going to keep this going behind my back?" She closed her eyes, taking a shaky breath. "I didn't want you to find out like this. But yes, I was planning on ending things with Dan. I didn't know how to tell you." I stood there, feeling the weight of everything pressing down on me, the betrayal cutting deeper than I ever thought possible. "Do you love him?" I forced myself to ask, the words nearly choking me. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "No, it wasn't love. It was just comfort. Someone who was here. But it doesn't excuse anything. I know that. I'm sorry, Luke. I'm so sorry." Her apology felt empty, like a drop in the ocean of betrayal I was drowning in. I turned and walked out, leaving her sitting there alone on that couch, the words hanging in the air between us. As I stepped outside, the reality of it all hit me, and I knew that nothing between us would ever be the same. I couldn't stop thinking about it. Couldn't stop the betrayal from playing on repeat in my mind. Emma and Dan. Of all people. Every time I tried to wrap my head around it, the anger just burned hotter. Finally, I did the only thing that felt right in the moment. I called Dan. He answered on the second ring, his voice cautious, probably knowing why I was calling. "Luke, meet me at the old field, the one we used to run drills on." I cut him off, my voice hard and cold. There was silence on the other end for a second, but he agreed, his tone resigned. When I pulled up to the field, he was already there, leaning against his car, hands shoved into his pockets, looking uncomfortable. The second he saw me, he straightened, probably realizing from my expression that this wasn't going to be a conversation. I walked up to him, fists clenched, barely holding it together. "Luke, man, I know you're mad," he started, but I didn't let him finish. I swung hard, my fist connecting with his jaw. He stumbled back, shock in his eyes as he raised a hand to his mouth, checking for blood. "You're damn right I'm mad," I shouted, barely holding myself back. "You lied to my face, Dan. You looked me in the eye and lied about what happened with my wife." He steadied himself, his jaw clenched, a flicker of anger in his eyes. "I didn't want you to find out like that," he muttered, spitting a bit of blood onto the ground. "But it's not like you were around to see what was happening with her, Luke. Don't you dare try to turn this on me." I snarled, taking another step forward. "I trusted you. You were supposed to have my back, not be sleeping with my wife while I'm halfway around the world." He met my gaze, his face hardening. "And where were you, Luke? Off on some mission, like you always are, leaving Emma to figure it all out on her own. You think I planned this?" "I didn't, but she was hurting, and you weren't there. That was it." The words hit harder than any punch, cutting through the anger and hitting that sore spot I'd been trying to ignore. But the anger came back tenfold, fueling me as I lunged at him, tackling him to the ground. We went down hard, a flurry of fists and shouts. Years of friendship and respect shattered in an instant. We rolled in the dirt, both of us swinging, fighting as if that could somehow make sense of the mess. I landed a punch to his gut, and he retaliated, catching me in the side, knocking the wind out of me. But I barely felt it, the pain drowned out by the fury that had taken over. "You were my friend," I gasped, struggling to catch my breath as we separated for a second, both of us on our knees, panting, bruised, bleeding. "How could you do this?" He looked at me, his face bruised and dirty, a look of regret flashing in his eyes. "I don't have an answer, Luke," he said quietly. "I messed up, but I can't change what happened. All I can say is, I'm sorry." "Sorry," I spat, barely able to believe the word. "You're sorry? That doesn't fix this. It doesn't give me back my marriage, my trust in either of you." We sat there in silence, both of us broken, the weight of what had happened settling around us. I looked at him, really looked, and saw that he was just as lost as I was. And somehow, that just made it worse. After that brutal fight with Dan, I went back home, still seething, still grappling with the mess he and Emma had made of my life. I was bruised and bleeding, but that was nothing compared to the ache gnawing away inside me. Emma was there, sitting in the kitchen again, looking up at me with that same distant, almost apathetic expression. I could barely stand to look at her. "You really think this is going to fix things for you?" I asked, my voice colder than I'd ever heard it. "You think Dan's going to be different? He's still military, Emma. He'll still be gone on missions, still leave you waiting just like I did. It'll be the same life, just with a different guy." She looked away, sighing, as if I was the one not understanding. "It's different, Luke," she said quietly, barely glancing at me. "Dan, he was there when you weren't. He understood me in ways you never did." I shook my head, barely able to keep the anger in check. "You think he understands?" "The same way I understood what it took to keep this family together while I was out there. Risking everything? He'll be gone just like I was. And you're fooling yourself if you think otherwise." But she didn't respond, didn't argue, just sat there, that stubborn silence louder than any word she could have said. She was set on this, convinced that whatever connection she thought she had with Dan would somehow be different. I could see it in her eyes. She wasn't listening. She'd made her choice. And that's when the idea hit me. If she was so sure about him, if she thought Dan was the answer, maybe it was time to shake things up. She'd built her life around this image of stability, of comfort, of being the one in control. She'd shattered my life with her choices, betrayed me with someone I trusted. I wasn't going to sit back and let her walk away, thinking she could just move on with Dan and pretend everything would be perfect. I nodded, finally letting go of whatever hope I had left for her to come around. "Fine," I said, my voice tight. "If that's what you want, then go ahead. But don't expect me to make it easy." Emma looked up at me, her brow furrowing, like she wasn't quite sure what I meant. But I didn't bother explaining. I turned and left, already formulating the next steps in my head. If she thought she could just switch out one military husband for another, if she thought she could just go on with life as if I was nothing but a mistake to move past, then she had no idea what was coming. In the days that followed, I started making moves. I kept my head down, showed up for work, went through the motions, but beneath the surface, I was working on a plan. I reached out to a few contacts I'd made over the years, people who knew things about Dan, things that Emma wouldn't like if she found out. I'd kept these secrets close, buried for the sake of our friendship. But now I didn't owe him that loyalty. If they wanted a clean break, fine, but I was going to make damn sure they'd never forget it. It started as a half-formed idea, more a product of spite than any real attraction. Dan's ex-wife, Sarah, had always been around, part of the social circles on base. We talked a few times at gatherings, nothing deep, just a casual small talk that military families fall into so easily. I knew she'd been through her own hell with Dan, knew about the affair that had torn them apart. But I'd never really seen her beyond that context, until recently. After a few restless nights, I thought about reaching out to her. At first, it felt like crossing a line, something that I wouldn't have even considered before. But the more I thought about it, the more it felt right. It wasn't about falling for her. It was about making a statement. I wanted Emma and Dan to know that I wasn't just going to sit there, wallowing in the mess they'd made of my life. If they could both betray me and then expect everything to just settle down, well, they had another thing coming. So I reached out, a casual invitation to coffee at first. Sarah was a little hesitant, understandably, but after a few tries, she agreed. I'll admit, I didn't expect her to say yes, but I could sense the curiosity in her voice. Maybe she needed the distraction just as much as I did. We started with coffee, which turned into lunch, which eventually turned into a dinner date. It was simple, easygoing, nothing serious. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was the one in control. It didn't take long for word to get around. People talk on base, and it's not like we were trying to hide it. I figured Emma would find out eventually, and sure enough, it wasn't long before she confronted me, the hurt and anger flashing in her eyes. "So you're dating Sarah now?" she asked, her tone sharp, laced with accusation. I just shrugged, barely meeting her gaze. "Why do you care?" I replied, my voice calm. "You're the one who wanted out, remember?" Her jaw clenched, that familiar fire in her eyes. "That's different, and you know it," she spat. "She's Dan's ex-wife, Luke. Are you doing this just to get back at me?" I looked at her, finally letting myself feel the full weight of her betrayal, the anger that had been simmering for so long. "Maybe," I admitted, not bothering to sugarcoat it. "But maybe I'm just moving on like you did. Maybe I'm done waiting around." I could see the frustration in her expression, like she didn't quite know how to handle the fact that I wasn't playing by her rules anymore. And when Dan found out, he barely looked me in the eye, the tension thick every time we crossed paths. I could tell it ate at him, knowing I was spending time with his ex-wife, knowing that I had that door open now. But honestly, I didn't care. I didn't owe him anything, didn't owe her any explanations. For the first time, I was focused on what I wanted, not what they thought or how they felt. If they wanted to go off and pretend like everything was going to be just fine, they could. I was done caring. After a few dates with Sarah, things shifted. What started as a bit of revenge turned into something unexpected, something real. She understood the life, the sacrifices, the moments of emptiness that come with it. She'd been through her own heartbreak, her own betrayal, and somehow we ended up filling in the cracks for each other. I never expected to feel something again so soon, especially with Dan's ex-wife, of all people, but life has a funny way of turning things upside down. One evening, after a few too many drinks and hours of easy laughter, I found myself asking her to marry me. It wasn't planned or calculated. It just slipped out like something I'd been holding on to without realizing it. She looked at me, eyes wide, and for a second, I thought I'd blown it, that maybe I'd read too much into what we had. But then she smiled, that kind of relieved, happy smile that made her whole face light up, and she said yes. We kept it quiet at first. I wasn't looking to make a scene, and neither was she. But word got around fast. Emma, of course, found out. When I told her, the shock in her face was almost satisfying. She didn't say much, just stared at me like she couldn't believe I'd actually moved on, like she'd been expecting me to just stay wounded and broken by what she and Dan had done. And Dan? Well, that was a different story. He didn't have much to say, but I could see it in his eyes every time we crossed paths. That mixture of resentment and regret, that realization that I'd managed to turn things around and build a life he'd lost. It was a strange, almost twisted kind of justice. Then came the news that really changed things. After years of deployment, of being dragged halfway across the world on mission after mission, the commanders offered me an office position, something steady, a role where I'd be overseeing operations stateside. No more deployments, no more leaving at a moment's notice. I could stay with Sarah, build something stable, finally have a life where I wasn't always one foot out the door. It was everything I'd been waiting for, and I took it without hesitation. Dan, meanwhile, got hit with a different fate. The brass assigned him to a new series of deployments, long stretches out in places that none of us wanted to go. He'd be the one disappearing for months on end, leaving his life back home to hold together as best it could in his absence. It was like the universe had flipped our roles, giving me a shot at a steady life and sending him down the path I'd been trapped on for years. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd be home, finally able to have the life I'd always wanted, with a wife who understood, who'd been through the same storms and chosen to be here with me. And Dan? He'd be the one making those quick goodbyes, leaving everything behind while life moved on without him. It was a strange feeling, a sense of closure, like things had come full circle in a way that almost felt like fate. As Sarah and I started planning our new life together, there was a quiet satisfaction in knowing that after all the pain, all the betrayal, I'd come out the other side with something solid, something real. And for the first time in years, I could finally picture a future that didn't involve sacrifice or loss. Just a life, a real one, with someone who was as ready as I was to build it. In the end, it was a brutal, poetic sort of revenge. Emma got exactly what she'd chosen, a life with Dan, the same life I'd warned her about. When I told her I was filing for divorce, she tried to keep that detached calm, but I could see the cracks, the hint of fear behind her composed facade. She knew things weren't turning out the way she'd imagined, that the stable life she'd thought she'd find with Dan was slipping through her fingers before it even began. The timing couldn't have been more perfect. My new office position meant I'd be home, finally able to stay with Sarah, to have the steady life I'd always wanted but couldn't offer Emma. And Dan? Well, his new set of long, grueling missions was just beginning. I'd put in a quiet word with the commanders, a subtle suggestion here and there. And before long, they'd reassigned him to some of the longest rotations we had, sending him off to places he'd be gone for months, maybe longer. He'd be living that life now, the life of quick goodbyes and missing everything back home. Emma was forced to face the reality of her choices. She'd betrayed me, torn apart everything we'd built, only to end up right back in the life she'd tried to escape. It was almost poetic, watching her realize that the stability she'd longed for was now something I'd share with Sarah, that her fresh start was anything but. I don't know if she ever fully understood how much this life demanded or how it shapes you, but now she'd have to live it, waiting for Dan to come back, wondering if he'd be there for birthdays, anniversaries, the things that make life feel whole. And I had no sympathy left for her. She'd made her choices. Now, she'd live with them. Divorcing her was a clean break, almost satisfying in its finality. No fights, no drawn-out arguments, just a quiet severing of the life we'd shared, leaving her with the mess she'd created. And me? I moved on, took my office position, and built something new with Sarah. Some might call it fate, others might call it karma. Either way, it was the fairest revenge I could have imagined. Emma got the life she'd chosen, the life I warned her about, and Dan got the reality of a long-distance relationship with all the empty promises and lonely nights that come with it. For the first time in a long time, I felt at peace. Life had come full circle, and as far as I was concerned, it had served up justice in the most fitting way possible. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe. New cheating wife stories tomorrow.